Chief Inspector with the Met. Peter, good morning. Thank you for joining us again. Private security guards handcuffing violent suspects in a part of the Lake District with only 6 officers for every 100,000 people. This is obviously something we've discussed a lot on this programme. This is down to insufficient numbers of police officers, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's something we've been warning we're heading towards for some time. And as I think everyone will have heard me say repeatedly, our fears have been dismissed, our warnings have been dismissed as scaremongering. We're not crying wolf. We're pointing out what's happening, and everything we have predicted will happen is happening, and this is just the latest step in down the road, and we're spiralling into an abyss. The police service in this country, in England and Wales, is broken, and it is purely and simply because it has been denuded of resources.
This part of the country, this part of South Cumbria, it's physically, geographically as big as Greater London, covered by officers based at the police station in Kendal, and cuts mean that during the day no more than 6 frontline officers are on duty. Do you consider that to be anything like an appropriate number of police officers for an area of that size?
No. It's not safe for the police officers, it's not safe for the public. It's not anything like an effective and efficient police service. It can't deliver anything like adequate protective services to the public. It's just shambolic. It's a joke.
A security firm in the area, which is used by 30 venues in towns like Kendal and Windermere, they've said that police have agreed that their staff can use handcuffs in a 6-month trial. As I say, it's a firm that employs around 30 staff at various bars, hotels and restaurants across the Lake District. Is this better than nothing?
Possibly. Each venue needs to make its own decisions on its security and what it needs to do to keep its staff and clients safe and to deal with the incidents that are going to happen there. The police don't need to provide permission to people to use handcuffs. There's no restriction on the use of handcuffs. But the difficulty is that the law around making an arrest when you're not a police officer is quite complicated. I used to train security guards, so I know perfectly well what the situation is. They don't do it all the time. They won't do it very much, probably. And so, like anything else, if you don't use something all the time, you get a bit rusty at it. So mistakes will be made. There'll be unlawful arrests. And the biggest issue will be what they're going to do with them when they've detained them. If there's no police officers to come and deal with the incident, there's no police officers to come and deal with the prisoner when they've detained them. And then what's going to happen? It's a recipe for absolute disaster.
Well, the manager of this firm in question, Carl Newton, says the police don't make any arrests because they are never around. If someone's being extremely violent, we call the police, but we often end up waiting for 40 minutes. It's safer for us to use handcuffs, then we can hand the suspect over when police arrive. And so this is plainly, isn't it, a private company and venues and other organisations, in a sense, taking matters into their own hands because of that lack of policing in the first place.
Absolutely. And, he's got a point. If you actually detain somebody, then they're going to get violent. And just like the police use handcuffs and leg restraints and other things, anybody detaining somebody that's becoming violent is going to need to use those sorts of measures to more safely detain them. But that doesn't alter the fact, what are they going to do when the police still don't turn up? And what are the friends of the person they've detained going to be doing when the person is still there 30, 40 minutes later, now handcuffed and whatever? It is a recipe for disaster. It is something we have warned about for some time. I'm not blaming the venues. I'm not blaming the security firms. They're left in a totally invidious position. The problem is entirely the fault of this government and entirely the fault of Theresa May, from her days as Home Secretary carried through into her days as Prime Minister. And despite their lies, the cuts are still continuing. There's some give in some areas, but broadly speaking, the cuts are still continuing.
I think as well, Peter, what this does is throw into focus something that we maybe don't discuss as much as we should, that the cuts to police numbers are affecting people right across the country, not just in London. Obviously, we talk a lot about London because we've seen a spike in some of the worst kind of crimes over the course of the last year or so. But when we talk about police officers being lost across the country, 21,000, I think I'm right in saying, since 2010, we sometimes ignore the effect, or we don't pay enough attention to the effect that it has in other parts of the country. Do you get a sense that this is typical of what's happening outside of London?
It's absolutely typical of what's happening outside of London, where you had areas like Cumbria, where even when there were, the full police numbers we had in 2010, the coverage was plainly going to be sparse. But what you had was a small number of officers in the main towns, and then you had some officers responsible for rural areas, and then you had traffic officers sort of overlaid on top of that covering the county. And there was a reasonable degree, it was thin, but there was a reasonable degree of police coverage. But there were so few officers providing that as soon as you took a handful out of it, it was shot through with holes. It was just, totally inadequate. Whereas in the city, you could take quite a few officers out and still not really notice the difference. In terms of, there was a lot of numbers there to start with, so you take a few out of that and you've still got quite a lot. You take a few out of sparse coverage and there's hardly anybody left. And the worrying thing is that nothing ever happens in Cumbria and other rural areas like that until it does. The Derek Bird armed incident where he murdered people on a firearms rampage in Cumbria. Hungerford, all those years back. These things happen because there are not sufficient officers to get to them, so they get out of control. Whereas in the city, there'd be a quicker response, and things are brought to a standstill. So it's really concerning in rural areas.
And this is a point that Martin Plummer makes. He's the chairman of the Cumbria Police Federation. He says the capacity of the force has fallen since the gunman that you mentioned, Derek Bird, killed 12 people in that shooting spree back in 2010. He also says in rural areas like Cumbria, our village police stations have been sold off. How big a problem is that, the selling off of police stations?
To a certain extent, it's symbolic, but it's gone beyond that level now, because you've got counties with one police station open in the entire county. You've got counties with one or two places that accept prisoners in the entire county. And so you've got huge issues with travel time. Travel time for officers booking on duty and travelling to the areas they patrol and then travelling back to book off. You've got huge time being wasted with prisoners being arrested, transported halfway across the world to a custody suite, and then, you've got to get back to your patrol area. And so it's gone beyond the original sort of symbolic stuff. There were police stations that with transport and communication and stuff like that we've got now, that sort of post-dates the setup of a little village police station, a police house in every village. We could cope with losing some buildings, but it's gone way, way, way beyond that.
What can and what do members of the public do and say about this, Peter? Obviously, we get a response to that question, and we will here on LBC. But if someone is listening in a part of the country where they know that there is insufficient policing for their community, I mean, what's the best way to protest about that? What's the best way to try to get something done?
To their politicians. Most of these county areas, the true blue shires, they have Tory politicians. They need to make it plain to those politicians, their councillors, their MPs. They need to make it plain to them that unless they sort out policing, they won't be getting their vote. That is the only language politicians understand. And unfortunately, what happens is that the politicians just blame incompetent police, and people go away and they believe that. It's not incompetent police. The police are being burned out to the point where experienced officers are leaving in their droves, and it is entirely due to cuts in numbers that mean a proper service cannot be provided. It's not incompetence, it's not laziness. It is just total inadequate resources for the demand there is.
All right, Peter, thank you. Peter Kirk, former Detective Chief Inspector with the Metropolitan Police, joining me this morning on LBC 034.